Guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Claire and welcome back to my little reading writing nook. This is going to be the start of a new weekly writing vlog. And boy, do I have some writing updates for you guys. I think this is going to be an extremely writing heavy and busy week because I just have so much work to do. So in case this is your first time watching, I am in the midst of writing a YA epic fantasy with some Celtic mythos thrown in. I've been working on it for 3 years now. This is the first book that I've ever attempted to write, and I'm taking it very seriously because I want to query it to have it be traditionally published. While I've been working on it for 3 years because I mean, right now I'm only 25, so I was like 22 or 23 when I started writing it. So I had a very steep learning curve on what it took to write a book. And now I'm going through a very intensive editing process. And I'm very lucky to have a friend who I refer to as my secret editor friend, who not only has been willing to look at all variations of my chapters, but she gives a very brutally honest, cutthroat feedback. I recently sent her chapter 7, which is the climax to my act 1, and then we had the call. I talked to her for 45 minutes exclusively about my book. I took notes over it because she had a lot to say. She had a lot of questions and she had a lot of critiques. Honestly, involved a lot of developmental edits. But through talking it out, I don't think those previous 6 chapters are going to need too much developmental editing, although there will definitely need to be some things that I need to add. Some details and a couple new scenes, including a chase scene that I think will be really fun, a new scene between 2 primary characters. But my chapter 7, this climax, it needs so much work. She had questions about how like the citizens view the royalty, about the ceremony that was taking place, or rather the lack thereof. Like, what is the relationship between all these different characters and what's going to be the most effective dynamic for the story moving forward? And that was another thing, is we talked a lot about where is the story going from here. Keep in mind, my manuscript is written. I know where we're going from here. There are a few points that are non-negotiable. There are scenes, there are ideas that I'm writing this book to hit those scenes, to get to those points. But everything else in between, that's a little bit up for negotiation. And there are definitely new ideas that I'm carrying with me moving forward, which means that this manuscript, especially in Act 2, is going to need a lot of rewriting. Because while I think a lot of the essence of Act 2 is going to stay the same, a lot of those details are going to need to just be completely rewritten. Totally for the best. It actually saves me some logistical trouble moving forward, but it still requires a lot of work to add that stuff in there. My main questions to her regarding the climax to my Act 1, this chapter 7 that I'm referring to, and I put that in quotations because one of the things that we came to is that I think I'm going to split this chapter 7. It's pretty long right now. It's like 15, 16 pages. And just with the new information that I'll be adding, I have a really good point, a very dramatic reveal where I can cut that and start a new chapter. But beyond that, you know, this is the point in the book where everything changes for my main character, and I wanted to make sure that that got across. And while she said that she definitely could feel that this was a huge turning point in the book, she also felt that she wasn't sure that she, the reader, ultimately sympathized with my main character versus the opposition. And so that's something else where I need to go through. Although I don't want people to completely disregard the opposition, I want this oppositional character to be somewhat justified in what they're doing and what they're saying to my main character. But of course, we're with my main character. The story is written in a close third person, and so we're with this main character throughout the entirety of the book, and it's very important that we sympathize with him. And so it's like, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that everything still swings in my main character's direction? So I don't know if that sounds like a lot of work to you, but that sounds like a heck of a lot of work to me. The only nice thing about this is through talking it out, I do feel like I have a really strong handle on all the changes that I need to make. For chapters 1 through 7, I'm like, I know exactly what I need to add and where I need to add it. And because I have so many little pieces, I find that if I get bored or frustrated with one chapter, I can just pop on over to a few chapters earlier and work on that instead, just for a change of pace. And overall, the changes that I'm going to be adding are going to be really fun and add a lot of life and dimension and a little bit of lore to the story. So I'm really excited to crack into it. Am I a little overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work? Yes, but I have so much time right now, not just in the fact that we're still in quarantine. Beyond that, I have so much time because I'm not under contract. I don't have any deadlines. I don't have a literary agent or an editor or contracts to fulfill. I have as much time as I need with this first book to make it as refined and sellable as possible. I don't mind putting in the work now if it's ultimately going to help me land a literary agent or an editor in the future. Hey everyone, it is Wednesday, and the only thing I have scheduled for today is to finish the rough draft of, I don't want to keep calling it chapter 7 because by the time I'm done with it, it is not going to be a chapter 7. It's going to be like an 8 and a 9. So I'll call it the Act 1 climax. So just to finish the rough draft, the rewrite of the Act 1 climax, and to work on chapters 1 through 3, which require a little bit of add-ins and revisions. I always struggle with drafting. That is definitely the hardest part for me. I much prefer editing, and I still have to tell myself when I draft that it's okay to just throw down whatever. It does not have to be perfect. I sometimes will just get caught up and snagged in the details and spend way too much time trying to find the right word or the right phrasing. And then it never matters because by the time I'm done editing, everything has usually changed anyways. Although I am capable of fast drafting because I did a lot of fast drafting for NaNoWriMo, so I can do it. I just oftentimes need to remind myself to get into that mindset. Just throw down your ideas and make them prettier and more fluid and add in more details to round it out later. Before I get started though, like I told you guys yesterday, I know all the things that I need to add, all the little scenes or details for this first act that I'm deeply revising. However, I figured it would be a good idea to actually take the time to write those things out. That's not something I generally do, but I think it's going to help me in the long run. This is also something I haven't done since NaNoWriMo, where I basically very, very roughly drafted a chapter and then spent that day working on the chapter. And I think that's part of the thing that helped me with my fast drafting because I wasn't sitting there trying to think of what should come next. I definitely lean more towards being a pantser, being a gardener, than I do towards being a plotter. But my brain tells me I should do way more plotting because it does make things a little bit easier for me. I think I do work faster and cleaner if I have some sort of an outline. So I'm gonna work on this for like 15 minutes or so and then get started on my chapter 7. All right, guys, so I did all the way through the beginning of chapter 4. Some of the chapters just have little bullet points of things to add in or even take away. And then some of them have like basically the entire scene written out. And I really should use this method more often when I'm working through these edits. Even in just this session, there were certain things where I was like, oh, if this happens in the previous chapter, then I need to remember to include the detail or the ramifications in this chapter. And oh, don't forget to add this. And it just feels like everything is very tightly woven. Because I think one of the tricky things about writing a book, especially I think a speculative fiction, is that you have so many balls in the air, you have so many characters and details and world building and yada yada. Sometimes it's hard, at least for me, to take a second to pull back enough to really make sure that I have all the inconsistencies ironed out. And I think originally my plan was to just work on my Act 1 climax and then get to these chapters, but since I'm already in the headspace for these chapters and I already have a lot of the details written out, I'm just gonna go ahead and work on those, because then I can just focus the rest of the week on this Act 1 climax, and then just maybe I will be completely done with Act 1 and I can move on to Act 2. Hey guys, happy Thursday. It's a little bit later in the afternoon than I typically like to start writing. However, I had a very video editing focused sort of morning. Now I'm getting to my writing, and last night I was so completely caught up in this new scene before chapter 2, which in my head and even in my notes was more or less like a little interaction between these characters, and then it just turned into 3 pages. And I was just really into what I wrote, so I wanted to perfect it. And anyway, I have to go back through this entire chapter beginning to end, and not just what I freshly wrote, but what I had originally wrote, because now there's information in this original chapter 2 variation later in the scene that is no longer relevant because it's been covered in the new stuff that I written. So I need to go back through and just tighten everything up. And then I should be able to move on to chapter 3, which also requires a new scene at the beginning of the chapter, and it's going to be a chase scene, and I think it's going to be really fun as well. We'll see how long that takes me. And that chase scene at the beginning of chapter 3 is the thing I have the most detailed notes on. And then my current chapter 6, which is the party scene, is long enough that my secret editor friend and I decided that it would be best to split that chapter, but I don't think that's going to require too much editing. I don't generally try to leave my chapters with a cliffhanger necessarily, unless it requires one, as much as I really like zingers, just something compelling that the character says or does that makes you want to keep reading. Not necessarily in a Dan Brown way where it's maybe a little bit gimmicky, but just a little something. Nothing drives me crazier than when there's a book and it keeps ending its chapters on the character going to sleep. That is probably one of my biggest reading pet peeves. Ending a chapter with them going to bed, unless it's relevant to the plot, is just one of the most boring ways to possibly end a scene, in my opinion. Hey guys, so it's already Saturday and I didn't do too much writing yesterday, hence why there wasn't an update yesterday. However, I did have a bit of an epiphany that I wanted to talk through with you guys before I get going and finishing up my chapter 3, which I did get like the first half of that new rewrite done and it was really fun. And that kind of goes with my epiphany that I ended up having. So I am currently listening to Sarah J. Maas's new adult fantasy Crescent City. I love Sarah J. Maas. I love her books. I love her writing. I mean, she's like one of the most successful authors right now, so clearly other people feel the same way, but she also can be a little bit of a particular taste. I'm having such a great time with this new series, this new world, and there is a strange little similarity between this book and my current book, although I would not say they are anything alike. But with my book, one of the things that I am exploring thematically is how death and loss can change people, both for the better and for the worst, and exactly how and where that divergence can happen. In Crescent City, there's also something really terrible and tragic and personal that happens to the main character. And another similarity is that there is a time jump between the tragedies. Mine happens a decade prior to when my story starts, and there's a time jump within the book itself in Crescent City, like 2 years or something like that. And something I noticed in myself as a reader, although I'm sympathetic to the main character, so when she talks about the difficulties or has flashbacks or just kind of really revels in the tragedy that happened to her, there's a little bit of a mystery aspect which can be compelling, but for the most part I'm like, let's move on to the fun stuff. Like, I'm sympathetic, but I just do not want to linger in this sadness for too long. A little self-pity or reveling in the tragedy goes a long way, and I hit the point where I'm over it very quickly. And I think that's something that I just connected with my story, where like, yes, this really horrible thing happened, and I think I've come up with pretty creative ways to have him revel in that tragedy. But ultimately, I want to make sure that A, we're not going back to that moment very often, because then I think his character can end up feeling one note or like, oh, come on, get over it. Let's keep it moving. And that while we're in the present, I want it to be fun. I think this tragedy is a strong motivation, but it's not something that I have to keep reminding the audience about or living in it too much for us to be like, oh, that's a good motivation. Yeah, that's sad, and the revenge or the comeuppance for that tragedy, that emotional catharsis, will feel really good when we get there. But while we're in the present, let's just focus on the present and making that adventurous and exciting. That's something I really found in my chapter 2 rewrite, which ended up being an entire rewrite. I thought I was just adding a scene, but I ended up just rewriting what I already had, kept a lot of where they were and what they were doing, but I changed the tone of it. There's still mystery and excitement to it, but I made it a lot less serious. Because ultimately, when I think of my book, there's that darkness is definitely a part of it, but it's ultimately an adventure story. And so that's just something that I feel like has really clicked with me. And I had to experience it as a reader to really understand it as an author. Brandon Sanderson threw up a new video for his science fiction fantasy lecture series, and it had to do with character, which is my absolute favorite thing to talk about when it comes to writing. He mentions, just as an example, Star Wars, the original Star Wars trilogy, which everybody knows and loves, specifically A New Hope, specifically Luke, and how he was reluctant to go out into the world and go on to this adventure until his aunt and uncle were killed. And that just kind of brought me back to what I was already talking about, where it's like, that is really tragic. You know, that like sticks with Luke and haunts Luke. He's not talking about it every second on screen. He really doesn't talk about it that much after the fact, and maybe in some ways that's a little bit of a flaw, and like film has different ways of dealing with that kind of internal character stuff than a book does. We as the audience member, like, we still remember that, especially when he's fighting Vader and the Empire. Like, that's definitely a chip on his shoulder, but we don't need to be told every 2 scenes, you know, having Luke be like brooding about his aunt and uncle's death. Ultimately, he's just in the present working on the problem or the adventure at hand. And so I think that's just something that I'm now very much including in my work, and just making it more, not necessarily lighthearted, like these events don't matter or what's happening to my characters don't matter, but a little bit less dour, a little bit more fun and energized, and it makes me really excited to write. So I'm gonna spend my afternoon finishing up chapter 3, and I'll try to get in one last update for you guys. All right, we started the vlog in this corner. We're gonna end the vlog in this corner, but I just got done drafting my chase scene, and something that I found with myself when it comes to action scenes, because this is actually a pretty action heavy book, and I know just because I read a lot and listen to audiobooks, and I love action heavy material, but it is such a tricky thing to get across. How much detail actually bogs down the fight or the movement, the thing that's happening. And it obviously can vary from person to person. Somebody who is much more athletic or into something like jujitsu may have a better vocabulary and understanding of different fighting techniques than somebody, a layperson like me, that can get kind of overwhelmed by too much of that detail. And so it's my book. I'm writing it for myself, so I tend to keep the detail pretty light, but still hopefully grounded enough and fast-paced. That's my number one thing that I found with myself, is that I just want to make sure if there's something that's very movement heavy, that it's fast paced, so we get the sense that, you know, we're just going, and that the action that's happening, I also just hope is fun and just has good visual cues. Thus far, chase scene, I really liked. I think it was, even for a rough draft, pretty successful. I need to add just the littlest something to chapter 4. I'm just adding something for like consistency's sake at the beginning of chapter 4, and then I can move on to the climax of Act 1, which is gonna be a doozy. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and if you like these sort of writing vlogs, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more writing or reading related content in the future. Make sure to check out my Instagram, Miss Claire Bear, with 3 S's and Miss, if you wanna see any IGTV content that I've been throwing up there specifically about Celtic creature lore. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!